The Younger Edda. Introduction. The records of our Teutonic past have hitherto received but slight attention from the English-speaking branch of the great world as Yggdrasil. This indifference is the more deplorable since a knowledge of our heroic forefathers would naturally operate as the most powerful means of keeping alive among us and our posterity that spirit of courage, enterprise, and independence for which the old Teutons were so distinguished. The religion of our ancestors forms an important chapter in the history of childhood of our race, and its fact has induced us to offer to the public an English translation of the Eddas. The purely mythological portion of the Elder Edda was translated and published by A.S. Cottle in Bristol in 1797, and the whole work was translated by Benjamin Thorpe and published in London in 1866. Both these works are now out of print. Of the Younger Edda, we have likewise had true translations into English, the first by Dasent in 1842 and the second by Blackwell in his edition of Mallet's Northern Antiquities in 1847. The former has long been out of print, the latter is a poor imitation of Dasent's. Both of them are very incomplete. These four books constitute all the Edda literature we have had in the English language, excepting, of course, the single days and the chapters translated by Gray, Henderson, W. Taylor, Herbert, Jameson, Piggott, William and Mary Howard, and others. The Younger Edda, also called Snorri's Edda or the Prose Edda, of which we now have the pleasure of presenting our readers the English version, contains, as usually published in the original, the following divisions: the foreword, the Gylfaginning, the afterwords to Gylfaginning, Pragi's speech, the afterwords Kaldeskapermal, Hatatal, and then the Codex Regius, the so-called King's Book. This was presented to the Royal Library in Copenhagen by Bishop Brynjolf Sveinsson in the year 1640, where it is still kept. Number 2, the Codex Wormianus. This is found in the University Library in Copenhagen in the Arne Magnaan collection. It takes its name from the Professor Ole Worm, who died in 1654, to whom it was presented by learned Arngrim Johnson. Christian Worm, the grandson of Ole Worm and Bishop of Zeeland, died in 1737, afterwards presented it to Arne Magnusson. Number 3, the Codex Upsaliensis. This is preserved in the Uppsala University Library. Like the other two, it was found in Iceland, where it was given to John Rugman. Later it fell into the hands of Count Magnus Gabriel de la Gardie, who in the year 1669 presented it to Uppsala University. Besides these three chief documents, there exists 4 fragmentary parchments and a large number of paper manuscripts. The first printed edition of the Younger Edda in the original is the celebrated Edda Islandorum, published by Peter Johannes Reesen in Copenhagen in the year 1665. It contains a translation into Latin made partly by Reesen himself and partly also by Magnus Olafsson, Stefan Olafsson, and Tormod Torfason. Not until 80 years later, that is 1746, did the second edition of the Younger Edda appear in Uppsala under the auspices of Johannes Goransson. This was printed from the Codex Upsaliensis. In the present century, we find a third edition by Rasmus Rask, published in Stockholm in 1818. This is very complete and critical. The fourth edition was issued by Sveinborn Egilson in Reykjavik in 1849, the fifth by the Arne Magnaan Commission in Copenhagen in 1852, and all these 5 editions have long been out of print, and in place of them we have the 6th edition by Thorleif Jonsson in Copenhagen in 1875, and the 7th by Ernst Wilking, Paderborn in 1877. Both of these, and especially the latter, are thoroughly critical and reliable. Of translations we must mention, in addition to those into English by Dasent and Blackwell, Erne Rupp's translation into Danish, Copenhagen in 1808, Karl Simrock's into German, Stuttgart and Tübingen in 1851, and Franz Bergmann's into French, Paris, 1871. Among the chief authorities to be consulted in the study of the Younger Edda may be named, in addition to those already mentioned, Friedrich, T.H. Mobius, F.R. Pfeiffer, Ludwig Ettemüller, K. Hildebrand, Ludwig Uhland, P.E. Müller, Adolf Holzmann, Sophus Brugge, P.A. Munch, and Rudolf Kaiser. For the material in our introduction and notes, we are chiefly indebted to Simrock, Wilkin, and Kaiser. While we have had no opportunity of making original researches, the published works have been carefully studied, and all we claim for our work is that shall contain the results of the latest and most thorough investigation by scholars who live nearer the fountains of Oert and Mimir than do we. Our translations are made from Egilsson's, Jonsson's, and Wilkins's editions of the original. We have not translated any of the Hatatal, and only for the narrative part of the Skaldskaparmal, and yet our version contains more of the Younger Edda than any English, German, French, or Danish translation that has hitherto been published. The parts committed cannot possibly be of any interest to anyone who cannot read them in the original. All the paraphrases of the Asas and Asinius of that world, the earth, the sea, the sun, the wind, fire, summer, man, woman, gold, of war, arms, of a ship, emperor, king, ruler, etc., are of interest only as they help to explain passages of Old Norse poems. The same is true of the enumeration of meters, which contains a number of epithets and metaphors used by the skalds, illustrated by specimens in their poetry, and also by a poem of Snorri Sturluson written in 100 different meters. There has been a great deal of learned discussion in regard to the authorship of the Younger Edda. Readers specially interested in this knotty subject, we must refer to Wilkin's elaborate treatise Untersuchungen zur Snorra Edda, Paderborn in 1878, and to P. Muller's Die Aardheid der Aselehre in Copenhagen in 1811. Two celebrated names that without doubt are intimately connected with the work are Snorre Sturluson and Olaf Thordson's Vitaskald. Both of these are conspicuous not only in the literary but also in the political history of Iceland. Snorre Sturluson was born in Iceland in the year 1178. 3 years old, he came to the house of the distinguished chief Jon Loptsson at Odde, a grandson of Saemund the Wise, the reputed collector of the Elder Edda, where he appears to have remained until Jon Loptsson's death in the year 1197. Soon afterwards, Snorri married to a wealthy family, and in a short time he became one of the most distinguished leaders in Iceland. He was several times elected chief magistrate, and no man in the land was his equal in riches and prominence. He and his two elder brothers, Thord and Sigvard, who were but little inferior to him in wealth and power, were at one time well nigh supreme in Iceland. And Snorri sometimes appeared at the Althing at Thingvolls, accompanied by from 800 to 900 armed men. Snorri and his brothers did not only have bitter feuds with other families, but a deadly hatred also arose between themselves, making their lives a perpetual warfare. Snorri was shrewd as a politician and magistrate, and eminent as an orator and skald, but his passions were mean, and many of his ways were crooked. He was both ambitious and avaricious. He is said to have been the first Icelander who laid plans to subjugate his fatherland to Norway, and in his connection is supposed to have expected to become a jarl under the King of Norway. In this effort, he found himself outwitted by his brother's son, Sturle Thordarson, and thus he came into hostile relations with the latter. In this feud, Snorri was defeated, but when Sturle shortly after fell in a battle against his foe, Snorri's star of hope rose again, and he began to occupy himself with far reaching, ambitious plans. He had been to the first time in Norway during the year of 1218 till 1220 and had been well received by King Hakon and especially by Jarl Skule, who was then the most influential man in the country. In the year 1237, Snorri visited Norway again and entered, as it is believed, into the treasonable conspiracies with Jarl Skule. In 1239, he left Norway against the wishes of King Hakon, whom he owed obedience, and thereby incurred the king's greatest displeasure. When King Hakon in 1240 had crushed Skule's rebellion and annihilated the dangerous opponent, it became Snorri's turn to feel the effects of King's wrath. At the instigation of King Hakon, several chiefs of Iceland united themselves against Snorri and murdered him at Reykjavík, where ruins of his splendid mansion are still to be seen. This event took place on the 22nd of September 1241, and Snorri Sturluson was then 63 years old. Snorri was Iceland's most distinguished skald and saga man. As a writer of history, he deserves to be compared with Herodotus or Thucydides. His Heimskringla, embracing an elaborate history of the kings of Norway, is famous throughout the civilized world, and Emerson calls it the Iliad and Odyssey of our race. An English translation of this work was published by Samuel Lyng in London in 1844. Carlyle and Early Kings of Norway, London, 1875, was inspired by the Heimskringla. Olaf Thordsson, surnamed Hvitaskald, to distinguish him from his contemporary Olaf Svartaskald, was the son of Snorri's brother. Though not as prominent as influential as his uncle, he took an active part in the troubles of his native island during the first half of the 13th century. He visited Norway in 1236, whence he went to Denmark, where he was a guest at the court of King Valdemar, and is said to have enjoyed great esteem. In 1240 we find him again in Norway, where he espoused the cause of King Hakon against Skule. On his return to Iceland, he served 4 years as chief magistrate of the island. His death occurred in the year 1259, and he is numbered among the great skalds of Iceland. Snorri Sturluson and Olaf Hvitaskald are two names to whom the authorship of the Younger Edda has generally been attributed, and the work is by many, even to this day, called Snorri Edda, that is, Snorri's Edda. We do not propose to enter into any elaborate discussion of his complicated subject, but we will state briefly the reasons given by Kaiser and others for believing that these men had a hand in preparing the prose Edda. In the first place, we find that the writer of the grammatical and rhetorical part of the Younger Edda distinctly mentions Snorri as author of Hatatal, the Clavis Meterica, and not only of the poem itself, but also of the treatise in prose. In the second place, the Arne Magnaean parchment manuscript, which dates back to the close of the 13th or beginning of the 14th century, has the following note preface to the Skaldskaparmal. Here ends that part of the book which Olaf Thordsson put together, and now begins Skaldskaparmal and the Kenninga, according to that, which has been found in the lays of the chief skalds, and which Snorri afterwards suffered to be brought together. In the third place, the Uppsala manuscript of the Younger Edda, which is known with certainty to have been written in the beginning of the 14th century, contains this preface written with the same hand as the body of the work. This book hight Edda, Snorri has compiled it in the manner which it is arranged. First in regard to the Asas and Ymir, then Skaldskaparmal and the denominations of many things, and finally that Hatatal, which Snorri composed about King Hakon and Duke Skole. In the fourth place, there is a passage in the so-called Annales Breviores, supposed to have been written about the year 1400. The passage relates to the year 1241 and reads thus: Snorri Sturluson died at Reykholt. He was a wise and very learned man, a great chief and shrewd. He was the first man in his land who brought property into the hands of the king of Norway. He compiled Edda and many other learned historical works and Icelandic sagas. He was murdered at Reykholt by Jarl Gisur's men. It seems then that there is no room for any doubt that these two men have had a share in the authorship of the younger Edda. How a great share each has had is another and more difficult problem to solve. Rudolf Kaiser's opinion is, and we know no higher authority on the subject, that Snorri is the author, though not in so strict a sense as we know use the word, of Gylfaginning, Bragi's speech, Skaldskaparmal, and Hatatal. This part of the younger Edda may thus be said to date back to the year 1230, though the material out of which the mythological system is constructed is of course much older. We find in the ancient Vala's prophecy of the Elder Edda a poem that breathes in every line the purest Asa faith and is, without the least doubt, much older than the introduction of Christianity in the north or the discovery and settlement of Iceland. It is not improbable that the religious system of the Odinic religion had assumed a permanent prose form on the memories of the people long before the time of Snorri, and that he merely was the means of having it committed to writing almost without verbal change. Olaf Thordsson is unmistakably the author of the grammatical and rhetorical portion of the younger Edda, and its date can therefore safely be put at about 1250. The author of the treatise on the alphabet is not known, but Professor Kaiser thinks it must have been written its first chapter about the year 1150 and the second chapter about the year 1200. The forewords and afterwords are evidently also from another pen. Their author is unknown, but they are thought to have been written about the year 1300. To sum up, then, we arrive at this conclusion. The mythological material of the younger Edda is as old as the Teutonic race. Parts of it were written by authors unknown to fame. A small portion is the work of Olaf Thordsson. The most important portion is written, or perhaps better compiled, by Snorri Sturluson, and the whole is finally edited and furnished with forewords and afterwords early in the 14th century, according to Kaiser about 1320 to 1330. About the name Edda, there has also been much learned discussion. Some have suggested that it may be a mutilated form of the word Odde, the home of Semund the Wise, who was long supposed to be the compiler of the Elder Edda. In this connection, it has been argued that possibly Semund has begun the writing of the younger Edda too. Others derive the word from Oder, mind, soul, which in poetical usage also means song, poetry. Others again connect Edda with the Sanskrit word Veda, which is supposed to mean knowledge. Finally, others adopt the meaning which the word has where it is actually used in the Elder Edda, and where it means great-grandmother. Vigfusson adopts this definition, and it is certainly both scientific and poetical. What can be more beautiful than the idea that our great ancestress teaches her descendants the sacred traditions, the concentrated wisdom of the race? To sum up, then, we say the Younger or Prose or Snorri's Edda has been produced at different times by various hands, and the object of its authors has been to produce a manual for the skalds. In addition to the forewords and afterwords, it contains two books, one of greater Gylfaginning and one of lesser Bragi's speech, giving a tolerably full account of the Norse mythology. Then follows Skaldskaparmal, wherein is an analysis of the various circumlocutions practiced by the skalds, all illustrated by copious quotations from the poets. How much of these three parts is written by Snorri is not certain, but, on the other hand, there is no doubt that he is the author of Hatatal, Clavis Metrica, which gives an enumeration of meters. To these four treatises are added 4 chapters on grammar and rhetoric. The writer of the oldest grammatical treatise is thought to be one Thorod Runemaster, who lived in the middle of the 12th century, and the third treatise is evidently written by Olaf Thordsson in Vitaskald, the nephew of Snorri, a scholar who spent some time at the court of the Danish king Valdemar the Victorious. The Younger Edda contains a systemized theogony and cosmogony of our forefathers, while the Elder Edda presents the Odinic faith in a series of lays or rhapsodies. The Elder Edda is poetry, while the Younger Edda is mainly prose. The Younger Edda may in one sense be regarded as the sequel or the commentary on the Elder Edda. Both complement each other, and both must be studied in connection with the sagas and all the Teutonic traditions and folklore in order to get a comprehensive idea of the Asa faith. The two Eddas constitute, as it were, the Odinic Bible. The Elder Edda is the Old Testament and the Younger Edda the New. Like the Old Testament, the Elder Edda is in poetry. It is prophetic and enigmatical. Like the New Testament, the Younger Edda is in prose. It is lucid and gives a clue to the obscure passages in the Elder Edda. Nay, in many respects do the two Eddas correspond with the two testaments of the Christian Bible. It is a deplorable fact that the religion of our forefathers seems to be but little cared for in this country. The mythologies of other nations every student manifests an interest for. He reads with the greatest zeal all the legends of Rome and Greece, of India and China. He is familiar with every room in the labyrinth of Crete, while when he is introduced to the shining halls of Valhall and Gladsheim, he gropes his way like a blind man. He does not know that Idun with the beautiful apples might, if applied to, render even greater services than Ariadne with her wonderful thread. When we inquire whom Tuesday and Wednesday and Thursday and Friday are named after and press questions in reference to Tyr, Odin, Thor and Freya, we get at best but a wise and knowing look. Are we then, as a nation, like the ancient Jews, and do we bend the knee before the gods of foreign nations and forsake the altars of our own gods? What if we then should suffer the fate of the unhappy people, be scattered all over the world and lose our fatherland? In these Eddas our fathers have bequeathed to us all their profoundest, all their sublimest, all their best thought. They are the concentrated result of their greatest intellectual and spiritual effort, and it behooves us to cherish this treasure and make it the fountain at which the whole American branch of the Yggdrasil ash may imbibe a united national sentiment. It is not enough to brush the dust of these gods and goddesses of our ancestors and put them up the pedestals as ornaments in our museums and libraries. These coins of the past are not to be laid away in numismatic collections. The grandson must use what he has inherited from his grandfather. If the coin is not intelligible, then it will have to be sent to the mint and stamped anew in order that it may circulate freely. Our ancestral deities won the place in our hearts and in our songs. On the European continent and in England, the zeal of the priests in propagating Christianity was so great that they sought to root out every trace of the Asa faith. They left but unintelligible fragments of the heathen religious structure. Our gods and goddesses and heroes were consigned to oblivion, and all knowledge of the Odinic religions and of the Nibelung story would have been well nigh totally obliterated had not more one lucky star hovered over the destinies of Iceland. In this remotest corner of the world, the ancestral spirit was preserved like the glowing embers of Hekla beneath the snow and ice of the glacier. From the farthest Thule, the spirit of our fathers rises and shines like an aurora over all the Teutondom. It was in the year 860 that Iceland was discovered. In 874, the Teutonic spirit fled thither for refuge from tyranny. Here, a government based on the principles of old Teutonic liberty was established. From here went forth daring Vikings who discovered Greenland and Finland and showed Columbus the way to America. From here to the coast of Norway, Sweden, Denmark, England, and Germany were supplied with skalds to sing their praises. Here was put in writing the laws and sagas that give us a clue in the form of old Teutonic institutions. There was preserved in the Old Norse language and in it a record of the customs, the institutions, and the religion of our fathers. Its literature does not belong to that island alone. It belongs to the whole Teutonic race. Iceland is for the Teutons that Greece and Rome are for the south of Europe, and she accomplished her mission with no less efficiency and success. Cato the Elder used to end all his speeches with these words: Praeterea censeo Carthaginem esse delendam. In these days, when so many worship at the shrine of Romanism, we think it perfectly just to adopt Cato's sentence in this form: Protera censeo Romam esse delendam.